Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the GSA Practice Lectures series. Thank you all for attending, and those that are still joining, welcome, welcome. My name is Emmanuel Ngambole from the GSA, and today I will be moderating the talk today. Just to give an introduction to the 2026 theme of the GSA Practice Lecture series. This year, the GSA is inviting architectural and special practitioners to speak to our community about how they are transforming their practice ground through recombination, collaboration, refusal, and making anew. Rather than the customary presentation of showing completed buildings, this year's focus is on a lecture series that foregrounds adaptive practice models, contingent, responsive, and continuously redefined practice models. These GSA practice lectures offer a practitioner the opportunity to really reflect together with the community of practice, which is yourselves and us as academia, on the constitution of their practice, how that practice is organized, how it evolves, and how fluid it is, collaborations, systems, and networks from that form that practice ground. Also just the way that the practice conducts and sustains special production. So as part of our practice ground, these sessions are always online, and they are also in the evenings to make it more accessible to most of you, to ensure also the widest possible participation from your community. And also we think of this space as a collective reimagination of architectural doing. Our guest today is no stranger to the GSA. He's also a returning speaker. Our guest speaker today is Mphethi Morojele. Mphethi is from MMA Design Studio, which was founded, which he founded in 1995 as MMA Architects, just after the dawn of democracy in South Africa. Since then, the mid-sized practice has evolved in transforming and redefining the South African and African architectural and urban landscape in many ways through various award-winning, iconic, and groundbreaking projects. The practice was formed as a critical and situated practice, treating architecture as a tool for social critique and empowerment through questioning the then dominant cultural, economic, and political norms in the country. This approach has necessitated an interdisciplinary approach in the practice, combining architecture, urban design, sociology, philosophy, and art to expand the field's research. The practice has also always maintained links with academia in an attempt to blur the lines between design, teaching, writing, and activism. The practice continues to provide an enabling environment for young architects, especially from previously disadvantaged backgrounds, in an effort to transform the architectural landscape. And also the research interests of the practice include learning from indigenous spatial practices, and emerging residual local cultural practices linking the creative practice to place. The practice employs a strong conceptual approach to architecture based on understanding and interpretation of often difficult social, cultural, economic, and ecological context. So I will hand over to Mphethi, and I will please request that you just keep your mics and video off during the presentation, not to interrupt. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And also just for those who need to claim for CPD, we will provide a CPD link on the chat. So watch out for the chat closer to the end of the talk. We'll also give you an opportunity to type in your questions on the chat so that when he completes the presentation, he'll be able to respond. So Mphethi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and to all the guests who have braved this cold night to come and listen online to this talk. So I think it was quite fitting that we started this presentation with the music of Abdullah Ibrahim, one of our finest exports of jazz musicians, who I greatly admire, and who unfortunately we lost earlier this month at the age of, I think he was over 90. But when we talk about a situated practice, I think in terms of music and South African jazz, that is almost one of the quintessential South African jazz musicians who situated his practice directly in what South Africa was and what it came to be. I think this question of talking about a situated practice is designing and researching from a very deep, specific connection to a local place, culture, and the social conditions, rather than using universal templates. So contextualism becomes important over templates. Cross-boundary, multidisciplinary forms of practice become important. And equally so, a critical engagement with architecture. Hence the question, can architecture be a tool for social critique and empowerment? And can architecture challenge and transform dominant cultural, economic, and political norms? You must remember that the transformation that has happened in this country in the last 30 years has been immense, and not a lot of countries have in the last period seen such transformation. And so when I started architecture, really it was right at the dawn of democracy. And these were the questions that we were asking of ourselves. What is the role of architecture in transforming society away from a kind of what was then dominant, the dominant cultural and political norms? So in situating oneself, it's almost autobiographical in that one has to kind of dig into where you come from and where you grew up. The image you see at the bottom here is my parents who met in Johannesburg. My father was studying at Wits in the 50s and coming from Lesotho, and my mother was from Soweto. And this is their journey of traveling between Lesotho and Soweto all those years, as what then would have been seen as just natives going about their business. So a quick timeline, as I said, my father's from Lesotho in a mountain area called Mogotlong and the Drakensberg. My mother's from Soweto in Orlando West in Vilakazi Street. And because of my father's work, he was an international civil servant, so we traveled to many countries growing up. I think by the time I was 18, I'd lived in about 5 different countries. As you can see here, and I've tried to show a timeline of what were the most significant events that were happening during this period. So some of the landscapes I grew up in, this is just a snapshot as one tries to reflect on your own architectural kind of sensibility. You kind of reflect on how you grew up and what impressions became important for you. So I grew up in Lesotho in Ethiopia, the highlands of Ethiopia, in Rome in Italy for a spell, in the rolling hills of Swaziland, where I went to school at some point. And then similarly in the kind of desert landscapes of Botswana. So I think when I reflect back that in a way that these kind of landscapes, these varying landscapes had a big influence on how one views both architecture and culture because once you're immersed in very different cultures, you understand that the way architecture is made is purposeful, it's intentional, and it's meant to reflect people's ideas of what the ideal world is, their ideal worldview. So then the foundations of architecture, I started UCT in the early 80s. And in those days, obviously, apartheid was big, was still ongoing. So we were not allowed to stay on campus. We had to stay in the townships and basically get bussed into studio every day and bussed out again in the evening. It was also a time of a heightened political uprisings, and the liberation struggle was like in full swing, including on university campuses, against a backdrop of some of our lecturers who were trying to deal with or starting to deal with what it means to be regionally, critically regional. People like Roelof Etenbogart, who was one of our lecturers, and others of that time. And then for me, I think being an activist, you end up being more involved in the kind of art, the literature, the drama, music, and poetry of the time, through different social movements and organizations, but which were mostly involved in the arts. And hence it raised a lot of questions for those of us who are doing architecture. What is the role of architecture at the time of the activism and at the time of fighting for this liberation? So at the time, I kind of got a bit disillusioned with architecture, and I went to other forms of expression, fine art, music, and I felt that these were much more relevant in those days than architecture, because as we know, architecture requires patronage, it requires money, it requires power, and these were not really available to us at that time. So after my studies at UCT, I worked a little, and then I went to the Bartlett in London. I got a scholarship to go there. And it was a real eye-opener to me because, one, it expanded the idea of what architecture is, as the Bartlett is famously known for that. And that, it also exposed us. We traveled to India to work in some of what they call shanty towns. As part of our course, we also traveled and looked at different types of architecture, the Mughal architecture of rural India, etc. And it really opened our eyes because in Cape Town, all the architecture we ever knew and discussed and were taught about was all from a kind of a Western perspective. And we also got to meet with a lot of students from different parts of the world. So for me, that was a real foundational thing. The idea that architecture can be spatial practice beyond buildings. The idea is that there's alternative forms of technology that one can experiment with, and that there are different types of architecture, different challenges around the world that really sometimes showed us that they are similar to what we were facing, but also very different in different ways. So when I came back, I went to Wits University as a lecturer. And it was a time, I think 95, 96, when architects were really kind of trying to grapple with what this new world means. How do we bring in voices which had not been heard before, which had not been recognized? So people like Peter Rich, who were teaching alongside Joe Nowero, and then the work that was coming out of Durban, particularly around the Warwick Triangle, and all these ways of trying to grapple with recognizing people who had not been recognized as citizens previously. and what kind of forms of architecture would that kind of create. So one of my first assignments, as a lecturer, I also was practicing part-time in what was called a community-based public works program, which was then started by the Department of Public Works around about 97, I think. And in these kind of programs, you as an architect would be given the money to do the project, working with the community, training bricklayers, training all the other artisans from the community, building the project to completion. So I think it was when there was this new interest in community-based programs, which we had to be labor intensive, had to be able to be built by communities, and it really got me to kind of understand the basics of construction on site at a very kind of basic and simple level. And these were the kind of projects that I worked on for a couple of years, mostly community-based, mostly educational projects, community halls, schools, etc. But at the same time, I was interested in looking at other forms of architecture that maybe came out of more traditional settings. Looking at the work of Franco Frescura, and then also some of my own research, which I did in Lesotho, to try and recreate kind of more traditional settings and see how those could be brought into a more urban context. And then in 1990, when was it? About 2000, we got our big break. I had my partners, people I'd known when we were younger, who had then gone into exile in Germany, and who had then come back after exile, and we started a practice together. And we were awarded the project to build the first South African embassy in Berlin because of them having studied in Germany, understanding German, and having worked in Germany, and myself having been based here and practicing here. And that kind of set us off on a trajectory of working towards kind of looking at iconic projects for the new South Africa and what and how they could come into being. So some of our early kind of explorations, trying to look at traditional materials, traditional colors, forms, and how this could be translated into more contemporary forms of architecture. Something that we still are on the journey today. And trying to bring some of that experimentation into the actual fabric of the architecture through kind of using South African artisans, trying to look at different ways of using the materials in more contemporary ways. So it was an exciting time in that we were given license to innovate because everybody was searching for how do we express ourselves as this new country. Again, similarly with the project in Ethiopia, it's again a way to experiment and try and understand how we could start to develop a language for our architecture, and working with artists, as you can see on the left bottom. It's always been one of my things that we kind of work with other cultural practitioners who can bring new eyes to a situation and bring new ideas. In Johannesburg, the practice was working a lot with the JDA and with different collaborators. Albone Cossack is one of them. And the inner city, again, trying to bring new forms of expression, new spatial typologies into this inner city. in places where, you know, the people who had inhabited these places were kind of illegally or informally inhabiting them. And how do we then begin to institutionalize and create the types of spaces that can find resonance with people mostly coming from some of the rural areas. And then another seminal project, obviously, is the Freedom Park project, which we were pointed to after competition in about 2000. And over 10 years has provided a kind of a breeding ground for some of the ideas which have become part of the practice. Some of the theories, some of the kind of spatial ideas, and some of my own personal concerns. So having built up a body of work over this period of 30 years, I think I'm at a place now where I'm kind of reflecting back on how the practice was formed, how it continued, and what are the takeaways from it. So a few years back, we went with the practice on what they call values training, which was a process of what they call discovering your purpose. And I think this has become a very important thing, even for people who are embarking on their own practices, is really to say, what is your purpose? How do you discover your purpose? And these were some of the questions we went through, which you can read. Why does your business's existence matter? Why are you important to the people you serve? Why would anyone dedicate their precious time, energy, and passion to your company? Why do you do what you do? Et cetera, et cetera. So we went through this exercise, and the team developed a series of culture and values, which we then workshopped and agreed with. The idea of being creativity, being innovative, the idea of working with art and artistic appreciation, always challenging ourselves to achieve as much as we can. The collaborative environment of ideas and ideation. We don't have a kind of a hierarchical design culture, but that, you know, ideas come from everywhere and anywhere. Ability utilization is that we try and make each person in the studio be the best of themselves, of what they and what they can bring to the table. And personal development, where we encourage people to develop not only architecturally, but in the other fields or their concerns. And of course, all of this is because we have a concern for others, for the betterment of lives of other people. So this kind of set us, okay, also, and then the collaborations, which over the years we have had and we continue to have, and which we enjoy. Because I think collaborations, as we said right at the beginning, in a situated practice, means that you do not have all the answers, you do not have all the experiences, and that collaboration can bring new ideas, new ways of seeing things. So the process is a bit messy, it's a bit rough, but it's very exciting. The studio culture, the building, because we build. We think it's very important not just to theorize, but also to build, because there's this loop between making and thinking, and making again and thinking. Teaching is very important, because not only do you pass on knowledge, but you're actually learning yourself through teaching. Research, which is part of our process, working in a situated situation. Competitions, and then of course running the business and collaborating with others on the business. So it becomes quite this like process of a studio which involves a lot of people. Often a lot of people are not recognized. It involves a lot of activities, some which are extramural to the practice, but all feed into what our practice is about. A lot of it is an analog process. Myself, you do a lot of sketching. That's my design process, especially at the beginnings of projects, hand sketches. I'll sometimes lock myself away for a couple of hours and just sketch on one piece of paper as much ideas as you can. But now with other forms of representation, we're beginning to bring in a more digital process. So there's this moving continuously between the sketches and then the visualizations, the overlay with some kind of narrative process, just to kind of tease out what the salient points of what it is you're trying to achieve with the project, what its context is, its historical context, which comes from the context of the site. And this is kind of a way in which we run through a design process. A lot of it is often not known by the clients and is not made evident, but it helps us to elaborate our ideas in the design. And then, of course, there's always the theory, the kind of books that, particularly for me, what I'm interested in currently, some of the books on the theorizing of architecture in sub-Saharan Africa, which has become more and more relevant. And then this idea of the Anthropocene, the post-Anthropocene, which is a world where we are no longer in control as human beings of nature and natural things, and all sorts of other theories, which I don't think we really have time to talk specifically about. But theory, having been a lecturer, I think theory is a very important component of how we run the practice. So a very important component is doing competitions, both locally and internationally. Because competitions give you, especially ideas competitions, give you an opportunity, one, to test your team, because often you get like just 3 weeks to do a design and get it presented and come up with all the concepts. So it really is like a training exercise. But two, also it allows you to explore some of the ideas that you cannot often explore in conventional kind of building projects. So and the pleasure of doing them, seeing the ideas, presenting them, is something that also keeps the studio fresh. So these are various competitions. This was for one in Botswana. This was one in Kinshasa in the DRC. Some are invited, some you just find online. This is again presentations for our competition in DRC. This one was in Saudi Arabia in the Al Ula Desert. Again, an invited international competition. And as I say, they really allow you to explore some of the ideas that you won't really be allowed to explore in conventional projects. And also they put your name out there. Once you've competed in a competition, even if you're not successful, but you tend to then get invited to other competitions. And then the teaching and the student work. That again, when I first started, I was a full-time lecturer at WITS for about 5 years. I taught first year, and then I went to third year, and then I taught 6th year, and then came back to honors. And each one has its own challenges. Each one has its own joys and lessons. This is an example of honor students from WITS, where I've been running a series of elective studios in Soweto particularly, because I'm trying to understand and to kind of see if there's a way that the kind of culture that's coming out of Soweto can bleed into the architecture, the culture that is coming out of the music, the fashion, the dance. It's quite a rich culture that architecture still needs to also find its expression. So we've been running a series of studios in Soweto with honor students. Each studio has a very particular theme and a very particular way of bringing out a design process. Some are more intuitive processes, some are more research-based, and some are more just finding poetic expression. So you'll see on the left here where one of the students was looking at the whole Pantsula culture and seeing how that could then inspire certain forms of space making, or through magic children's narratives and children's stories that you can now begin to imagine how a child would imagine a space as the one on the right. And the students are very inventive. I think I enjoy and I learn more often from the students than me actually teaching them. And what we learn here goes back into feeding our practice in almost a direct way. I think a lot of students have come through our office because of the relationship that we have with academia. And a lot of architects say that the reason why you teach is, number one, so that you also learn and you continue learning, but more importantly, you are able to spot and attract talent into your office. And it's that talent who also have the same kind of design ethos that you have. So there's this continuation between the studio in your studio in practice and the studio in the universities. Another important thing that we've increasingly been doing is looking at exhibitions and installations. Again, this is another way of research through design. So we've done the Biennale exhibition in Venice, which was again the first time South Africa participated in the architecture Biennale. And we were looking at what it meant, this new country between ownership and what belonging, which is a term that came from Achille Mbembe, who was talking about how in this new South Africa, people were coming. So there were some people who kind of had a lack of ownership of the built environment, and there are others who had a lack of belonging, and that there was this transitional space, which we were then, our exhibition was about looking at these transitional spaces at the time. Also exhibiting one's own work and having discussions, debates about it becomes important. It can be scary sometimes. You have to make yourself vulnerable, but in the end, I think it's a very rewarding process. And then working with artists, sometimes the product is not necessarily a building, but it could be an installation. But the ideas are the same. The ideas that we have in spatial practice are the same as how one would develop an installation. And again, this is another example of trying to expand the practice. This was the installation in 2023 at the Venice Biennale, which themes were around the discovery of the hidden landscape just outside Johannesburg, which was discovered through LiDAR technology. It's an old Tswana settlement, but you can't see it through visible eye. So we wanted to kind of commemorate this find in some way. So we took a group of dancers to go and do what's called environmental dancing, where they kind of perform in a ritual way in recognition or acknowledgement of the particular landscape. And that those dances were then filmed. We filmed them with drone technology from above, as well as from kind of body height, and played with this notion of taking on the bottom right the kind of LiDAR technology and recreating it in a different way. And that became a movie that was played on the floor in the exhibition, and then the kind of dance rituals were spread across 2 walls, so that people really got a sense of being immersed and embodied, had an embodied experience. And the idea here was that we're looking at what does embodiment mean coming out of neuroscience, and how can this be presented, how can it be explored using dance and ritual, filming it, and what are the implications for architecture? So again, these are experimental ways of trying to understand this expanded idea of spatial practice. The other exhibition we did, again, this was taking point cloud LiDAR data, which you see on the bottom in the blue, of the Sterkfontein caves. And through that, we're able to remodel the cave and imagine what the kind of rituals that would be happening in those caves would be. And we kind of tried to recreate them using dances, which you see on the bottom right. And then through that, we created this movie, which we presented at the AZA, which was again trying to understand, we called it the cradle of consciousness, trying to understand what a conscious mind at the birth of our consciousness, how did we perceive of space, and how can that help us today when we have to deal with challenging spaces. So again, it's these things are all feeding into the practice. It's not just building buildings, but it's also teaching, it's experimenting, it's trying to show exhibitions, it's using theories in expressive ways, not just writing about them. And hopefully something will come out of that, and something will bleed back into our practice of architecture. And I've started working with some animators to imagine different scenarios, doing some film sets. This one is for a film that imagines the future and what the kind of houses of the future would be. And again, it's working now between your sketches, the modeling, and then dropping it into AI, coming back to the sketches. So bringing in the kind of AI rendering into the imaginative process is becoming more and more relevant, but done in a careful way. I think one always has to keep control of the AI, and otherwise what I've noticed is that there seems to be what is called a harmonizing, where more and more people start developing the same type of things, because if you prompt it one way, it's these machines have been taught with a limited kind of vocabulary. and unless we have to actually teach them our own vocabularies. So this is like a very new kind of work that's coming. And again, producing stage sets for animated movies, which I never thought we would actually get to, but somebody just reaches out and says, can you imagine what this thing would look like? Can you visualize it for us? And there's a process by which we get into imagining what this is, which is both intuitive and kind of constructive. So you work from one level of being quite intuitive and playful into a more structured way of developing the ideas. So in conclusion, what does the future look like? I think I'm finding that there's potential for more diversification away from just doing buildings, but I think there's a lot of work in exhibitions, especially in exhibitions which are multidisciplinary or cut across boundaries. And that interest, there's a lot of scientific work that is stuck in books and in papers. And I'm looking at ways in which that kind of scientific knowledge, like the point cloud, like the LiDAR technology, can be exhibited in ways that are much more engaging for audiences. So there's different ways that the diversification is happening. I think another one, internationalization, both in terms of where projects are, because there's not a lot of work in South Africa, we have to try and reach out to other frontiers, and also in terms of staff, because I've got people who have worked in the practice but are now practicing in different parts of the world who we still maintain relationships with, and we still do work together. So that is you can almost have your team sitting anywhere in the world now, working on different projects. And then I think the succession of what comes next as we head off into the sunset becomes an interesting question. And yeah, documenting and archiving what has been this practice that's kind of comes with the maturity of a practice. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there and take questions if there are some. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mphethi. That was really inspiring. What I really took was your courage to dream, and just using that muscle or exercising that muscle of dreaming. I think that was something that really stood out in your presentation, especially how you are exploring various platforms of expanding imagination and sourcing ideas, and a sense of ubuntu it seems that comes across in the way that the practice operates. Just your statement now on continued collaboration beyond people that have worked in your practice. I think I really feel very inspired from this talk. And maybe just to kick off the Q&A session, I mean, this is probably another comment in how you've handled AI, where you're not being used by AI, but it seems like you're using AI just like you are using the other tools, just like you use the sketching technique, and how you are using the teaching practice, competition platforms, installation, exhibitions. I think that's really, I think it gives us a roadmap of how we could really still drive and own or maintain authorship in our ideas while using the available tools. So I found that there was a mature level of balancing that I've learned from. To end off with a question, you hint on the business of the practice. And I don't know if you have some few advice for young practitioners, especially those whose practices are really struggling, and what advice or key things you think your practice and your model of practice can learn about. How do you balance what you called it entrepreneurship? How do you balance this idea that a practice is a business because it's got bills, but at the same time, a practice is a place of creativity. It's not just mere money-making machine, but it's also a way of changing the world, making the world a better place.
I think words of advice, I think beyond running your business, I would say try and keep up to speed with the state of the art. You know, attending lectures such as this one, attending conferences, and right, it helps you keep up to speed. And you know, conferences are good for three things. They say one is the content, you're going to learn something new. Second is all the logistics around conferencing. But the third is the networks. And I think a lot of stuff has come through networks, and through giving lectures and through giving talks. So I think if one is to get your name out there, I think one would do it through keeping some kind of link with academia, keeping one's interest in where the art is going, the state of the art, and attending as many of these architectural gatherings and built environment gatherings as you can. That for me has always been a way of marketing. I think in terms of running the business, obviously, once you get the work, you have to do the work. And I think it's always living within your means, basically. Don't spend more than you have earned. And I think collaborations are important. You know, a lot of our work in the early days was we collaborated with big firms, because they had to, you know, because of BEE, they had to give us an opportunity. And those collaborations were mostly good. There were some bad ones, but you learn quicker. If you're a small practice and you work with a bigger practice, you can work on bigger projects, and you can understand the complexities of bigger projects. So yeah, I would say, and also it takes time. I think, you know, they say to start a business, it takes about 2 years before it stabilizes, between 2 and 5 years. An architectural business is even longer. So I think it takes a long time. Our projects take 4 years for one project, to see it from start to finish. So we need incredible patience, to get to where we want to get.
Yeah, that's very good advice, and I like the idea of the succession plan that you are already thinking. I'm just going to read. There's a comment here, then there's a question. I'll start off with the comment from Anab. Agreed. A firm that continues to encourage and support its staff to always develop themselves in the correct context will build good quality, long-term loyalty, and ultimately ensures long-term sustenance of the business. Too often nowadays, many practice dump onto staff unorganized workshops, causes only to be disappointed when the trained staff leave the company shortly thereafter. So that's a comment. I don't know if you want to say something about that, but it was a comment.
Yeah, I mean, people always say, what happens if you spend money, invest in training people, and then they leave? And the corollary of that is that what if you don't spend money on their development and they don't leave? So
That's an
spending money.
interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Then the next question is from Senzi. Senzi is asking, as someone who is deeply passionate about both architecture and art, I sometimes worry that pursuing one means compromising the other. Your career shows that it's possible to navigate practice, academia, creative work in a way that allows these disciplines to enrich one another. For someone at the beginning of their career, what advice would you give on building that kind of path? Where does one even begin?
In our time, we always were told that you've got to consolidate one, and then you can kind of dip into the other ones and dabble in the others, but consolidate one practice. I'm not so sure these days with the way the world is going, whether that advice still holds true. I'm sure there are ways that people can find their practices which are a complete mix of the art and the architecture. So yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't know if I have the answers. I think each person will find their own path based on understanding who you are and based on being authentic to who you are. I think people who try and mimic other people without understanding who they are themselves and end up not being authentic to themselves will soon find out. I'm not sure if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does for me, but I hope it does make sense for Sense as well. Any other question? I do welcome raising up your hand so that I can recognize you. And Boitumelo, please go ahead.
Hi, evening, everyone. I just have one question, Mphethi. I'm a design manager currently, and I work internationally. I just want to know, in terms of our context, from your experience, how do you find the balance between working on prioritizing the design versus your commercial outputs? Because that becomes important as an architect. How do you make the money?
Yeah.
How do you find the balance?
I think different projects have different points of balance. I think the more commercial projects tend to kind of be more working with templates, and you're kind of quicker in and out. So the balance with more commercial projects clearly clearly has its pace. You know, the requirements are different. The clients want you to finish as quick as possible. They have to. The project is about making money. Then there are other projects which maybe are more social or institutional, which have different kind of priorities. And then there are, of course, the projects which I enjoy the most, which are more cultural projects, where the clients are interested in the world of ideas more than the world of commerce. So I think it depends on the types of projects. And yeah, one would generally tend to gravitate towards the type of work you enjoy. Some people enjoy the more commercial, some enjoy the more institutional, some enjoy working with housing projects. So it's that diversification is always there, and each project has its own priorities, I would say.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Boitumelo. Tuto, please go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Nkambule, and good evening, Mr. Morojele. I've got two questions. First and foremost, lovely presentation. I think it was very insightful. The first one is perhaps what are your thoughts on the model of, I mean, the one thing that perhaps wasn't evident in this presentation, and perhaps it's a different lecture on its own, is how you set up your practice in your early years. And by that, I kind of mean the bones and skeletons of it. I think in the era when you were starting, a couple of, like you mentioned collaborators, for instance, a lot of practices pursued sort of, I'll call them joint ventures for lack of a better word, rather than sort of sole practice as a structure. How do you see that working nowadays? I don't see a lot of it happening. What were the benefits of it? But just your take around that, because I mean, seemingly even with commercial practices, you know, more and more practices are being absorbed, creating bigger groups, both locally and internationally. So what did that model look like then, and what does it look like now, and perhaps the pros and cons of it? That's the first one. And then the second one is, I remember watching one of these, an earlier edition of it, and I think it was with Olisi, and one of the things that emerged from it was this idea that part of the discussion was around sort of golf clubs and people who give each other projects. And one of the things that was synthesized from that conversation was this notion of being interesting people, and how interesting people attract interesting clients and interesting work. What would you say are the components of your personality, or perhaps your interests, that have made you an interesting person, that has attracted interesting relationships and networks for the projects that you've been commissioned for over the years?
I think the practice model when I started was that I was lecturing and practicing. So the lecturing paid the bills, and the practice was then able to eventually find its feet. And then I was full-time lecturer and a weekend practitioner. Then I became a half-time lecturer and half-time practitioner until I became full-time practitioner with the occasional lecturing. So for me, the model of using the institutions, academies, to kind of launch your practice was a good one. You also have access to cheap labor, students. So yeah, through that way, you could start to slowly kind of build yourself up. I've always believed that you should start at the bottom and slowly go up, slowly go up, get bigger and bigger. I've seen a lot of practices, young practices, which failed because you get a couple of guys coming together and they've got the business cards and they've got the cars and they're going out marketing themselves. But they've all of a sudden got all these expenses. And if the projects don't come, then what happens? So I believe in incremental growth rather than kind of coming with a big bang and then hopefully sustaining it. And these days, with the kind of the way the economy is going and the way practice is becoming more difficult, there are other models of collaboration where you don't have a standing team of people who you're paying every month, but that you kind of sub-consult and contract people on a project-by-project basis. Some people are finding it makes more sense for them to do that. One, because you can work remotely, but also because you don't have this big machine that you have to feed every month, whether there's work or not work. So I think the kind of agility, a certain agility is required these days, if I can put it like that.
All right. We thank you for that response, Mphethi, and thank you for the question too. That was a good question. We have shared the CPD points because we know the session ends at 7. but we don't chase questions away. I see there's still some comments on the chat. We can just linger maybe until 7:15. But if you need to complete the link for your CPD points, please do so. Then I'll probably take 2 more. Let's see what time we have. Yeah, we can maybe probably take 2. I see there. Tsepo has a question on the chart. It says, "What are MMA's internal measures of success for a project beyond external recognition, such as awards and competitions? How does the firm assess whether a project has achieved its intended social, spatial, environmental, or urban impact?" You want to take that, Mphethi?
Wow. I think this process now of documenting and reflecting back is probably going to answer those questions. We've just been so busy in just doing the work and getting it done that sometimes you don't have enough time to reflect. So I'm interested in reflecting and actually measuring success with these projects. And also, I think because some projects are quite old now. I recently went back to one of the early projects, which I did about 25 years ago. And it was so interesting to see how the materials had behaved, which materials had stood the test of time, which materials hadn't done so well, and how the clients had made changes. The users had made changes, what was working, what was not. After 25 years, it was very interesting for me to go back and kind of, like you're saying, measure the success of that project. But I think if one is now intentional about it and open to being disappointed, then it would be a very interesting exercise to do.
Heather is suggesting you do a practice-based PhD, time to reflect. So that's a comment from Heather.
I've been starting it for 4 years now.
Yeah, I think it's happening this year.
I would have finished it by now.
Nosipo has a question here. It says, "Firstly, what an experience to see this volume of work and how the growth of MMA has been relayed. Thank you. My question is, what's the biggest difference in how you approach a project when working across borders in Africa versus international commissions? And what should young technologists build into their skill sets now if they want that kind of Pan-African cross-border practice?"
I think it's critical to find a local partner wherever you're working, someone who you share the same kind of ethos, because then you're not going to be making obvious mistakes. They can, in all our projects on the continent, we've had a local partner. Hence, I think this idea of maintaining that network through conferences and through education and through exchanges is important, because if a project comes up in Burundi, I know that this so-and-so is there, they can work with us. So for me, it's again the collaborations which are important for success in environments that you might not be familiar with.
But maybe I might also add that you also have to develop a certain character as someone who does this collaboration, that you can be trusted, that you are the right person to work with, and that you provide a win-win situation for collaborators. Because I think for you to maintain those long collaborations and partnerships, and I mean, you mentioned that your former staff, you continue to work with them. And that's why I was talking about, this concept of Ubuntu kind of filtering into the model of the practice could be something interesting to reflect on, which ensures that these collaborations are extended. Okay, but I will just end off with, I think there's a comment here from, there's quite a lot of questions, but I can only just read the last one because of time. There's a comment from Mkolisi. Says, thank you, Mphethi, for such a thoughtful and inspiring presentation. I remember the early 2000s walking into architecture spaces and seeing you as the only other Black person in the room. For many of us, you came after. Your presence meant far more than you probably realize. An entire generation of younger Black architects hold you in the highest regard. The fact that you remain so intellectually curious, generous in spirit, and deeply committed to learning continues to inspire me. Thank you for leading by example, for continuing to show us what thoughtful architectural practice can be. We still have a great deal of work ahead of us, but you've done a great deal to move us along. So I think that's a good way to end off the blessed Rasta. I guess the Rasta is from former days. All right. Thank you, Mphethi. And really thank you for all of you, because you've really made this an engaging and a very interesting talk today. And I really appreciate all your participation. I think if we do these events and no one shows up, I mean, it's hard on us. So we really appreciate the good attendance and also your participation. I mean, it's online and sometimes it's difficult to have engagement, but you've really made it such a success. Okay, so before we close off, I've mentioned that the CPD link is on the chat, so please fill it up, and so that we can assist with the CPD certificate in due time. And also just to announce that our next practice lecture talk is set for the 11th of August, so on a Tuesday again, same time, same place. And our next guest will be Bongane Bona. Bongane is a PhD candidate and a lecturer from the Department of Historical Studies at University of the Western Cape. So we look forward to that, and we look forward to engaging with you. I think what we learned from Mphethi today is the value of going beyond your discipline to enrich the creative practice and sourcing ideas. So we do hope to see you again in the next talk. Otherwise, Mphethi, any closing words?
No, thank you very much. I think opportunities like this are good in that they give you a chance to reflect. So thank you for inviting.
Thank you, Mphethi. All right, and good night, everyone. Looking forward to see you next time.